This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com.
Welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm Steve Levin, the editor-in-chief of Market Pathways, which is our most recent publication here at MedTech Strategist, and Market Pathways focuses exclusively on MedTech regulatory, reimbursement, and policy issues. And glad that you can join us for this podcast series. Today's podcast is going to focus on MedTech reimbursement, and it's going to be a discussion that we had at our recent San Francisco Innovation Summit. And we thought the best way to really approach a complex area like reimbursement, rather than just talk theoretically about the world of getting paid for medical devices, is to focus on a couple of case studies. So what we did was we invited Chris Brooks from Impulse Dynamics and Heather Brown from HeartFlow, two companies with innovative cardiovascular technologies that have had success on the reimbursement front, to come and talk about their experiences in the hope that that would be helpful to other MedTech executives who are going through the reimbursement jungle. And along with Chris and Heather, we have Adi Rembaum, and Adi is with A&R Consulting. And one of the interesting things that I'd encourage you to listen for in this discussion is talk about the role of consultants in MedTech reimbursement. When you go out to get a consultant, what kind of consultant you need to look for. And both Chris and Heather talk about how their respective companies use consultants and how they're a critical part of the overall reimbursement pathway. This podcast is also particularly timely given the recent repeal of the MCIT program. MCIT, an acronym MCIT, stands for Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, which after being developed for about 10 years, came out of the previous administration only to be repealed. And it's something that is in the process of being developed, and it looks like it's something that might come back in some shape or form. So this is not what I'd call by any means a dead issue. So the whole issue of getting additional coverage for innovative technology is critically important, and it's also a way to really link the regulatory and the reimbursement process, which again, that kind of parallel type review is something that really can help companies and make this whole process much more efficient. And you'll also hear a discussion about the NTAP program, the New Technology Add-on Payments Program, which is again another way to get additional coverage for new technologies and a way to link the regulatory and reimbursement process. So those are a couple of highlights from this discussion, and we hope you enjoy the podcast. Thanks. So let's start out by talking a little bit about Impulse Dynamics and HeartFlow from a technological perspective. I don't want to assume that people in the audience know what both of your companies do. So, Chris, why don't you start talking about Impulse Dynamics?
Yeah, so we're a privately held company. We make a product, an implantable device for heart failure patients. The procedure itself is very similar to a pacemaker implant. So for those of you that aren't in the cardiovascular world, we've basically implanted pacemakers the same way for about 50 years. But we deliver a completely new therapy. So we're not about modulating heart rate or heart rhythm. We're all about dealing with symptoms of heart failure. So, it's one of the most costly chronic diseases for the Medicare program and the healthcare system in general. So, that's kind of who we are. FDA approval in 2019. We started to commercialize in the first quarter of 2020. Most of you know there was a significant global event that interrupted that process. So, we've kind of had to adjust some of our strategies in terms of that. But I think in terms of where most of the folks are in this room, like I said, we've got both FDA approval and CE mark approval. So we've largely navigated the regulatory process, and we're in that kind of, as Steve has called it, bridging the gap between regulatory approval and sort of normalizing the reimbursement landscape.
Great. Heather, talk a little bit about HeartFlow's technology.
Sure. So HeartFlow is also in the cardiac space, and we are a non-invasive diagnostic test for assessing the severity of coronary disease. So today, over 55% of the people that go into the cath lab for a diagnostic catheter angiogram do not require any intervention. So they're getting an invasive procedure that has both costs and risks and is not very pleasant, to find out that they just have to be managed medically. What HeartFlow does is takes a CT study, generates a three-dimensional model, and then calculates the blood flow through the coronary arteries. Using that information, then we can avoid about 60% of unnecessary diagnostic caths and help direct patients to the most appropriate treatment for them. And then a few details. We got FDA clearance in 2014, and then we've been on our reimbursement journey really since 2018 when we established Category 3 codes.
And indeed, give us a summary of A&R and what your area of expertise is.
Thank you. So I have a consulting practice called A&R Consulting. I've been working with medical device companies and diagnostic companies for 25 years or so, really helping them navigate this process from as early on as possible, meaning during the clinical development stage when they're shaping their clinical studies or thinking about getting to FDA. I try to advise companies on developing that strategic plan that's going to harmonize their regulatory strategy with their reimbursement strategy, because it is absolutely essential to understand how payers are going to look at your evidence and your data and how they'll use that information years after you've been working to develop it in that clinical stage. And so I'm a strategic advisor, and I can help companies think through all of these things. There are a number of consultants who can provide very tactical support for specific initiatives with CMS, with commercial payers and so on. And there's a large network of advisors who have experience through a variety of therapeutic areas that are eager to help in these situations.
So let me try to set the context for this discussion. When we were doing these meetings, I'd say 8 to 10 years ago, clearly the top issue that we would hear from small, mid-sized companies in particular, but also strategics, was regulatory. And that kind of coincided with Jeff Shurn coming on to lead CDRH. And I think there's widespread agreement that that situation has improved dramatically. And in its place, reimbursement really has become the number one challenge facing many startup companies, mid-sized companies, and also even when you talk to the strategics, it's still a huge issue. Does that coincide with your view and what you see in terms of the landscape generally? And let me also kind of piggyback onto that a question. There also, I would say, it seems to be a shift in overall strategy on the part of companies when they look at reimbursement. So, for example, not that long ago, I think particularly small to mid-sized companies would look at reimbursement and say, oh, well, that's something that we're going to get acquired, and our acquirer is going to focus on creating that reimbursement pathway, that reimbursement strategy. That's not something I need to worry about. I need to focus on product development and certain other core issues. Whereas now, I would suggest that maybe you don't need to build out a whole reimbursement plan, but you better have a really good idea about how you're going to get paid for your product. And I think that's something that potential acquirers now really look for, whereas not that long ago that wasn't the case. So, Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, so a lot in there, so I'll try to go backwards because I can remember what you said last first. The more understanding you have on the reimbursement picture, there's a direct linkage between how your product's going to be paid for and the value of your company. And I think one of the tendencies for a lot of entrepreneurial folks is to sort of overlay general market principles, supply and demand, for example, that you learn in business school. Those principles often don't apply in a terribly logical way in our healthcare landscape today. So I mean, it's very important to understand, where do we sit in this position? I tell people all the time, reimbursement is not this monolithic thing. Hopefully at least some of you have heard there's coding, coverage, and payment. I think it's really important to understand, where do I sit today? What's my status quo in each of those three buckets, and how can I improve that position? And as you improve each of those three kind of levers, that improves your overall reimbursement position. But again, the critical thing, if you're looking for an exit, is that your reimbursement position can directly impact your value. And the more you command it and the more you understand it, the more value I think you can drive from an exit point of view.
So let me ask you at Impulse Dynamics specifically. And again, you were at Abbott before Impulse Dynamics. So was there already a reimbursement plan, strategy, pathway, whatever you want to call it, in place when you come on? Were you brought on to implement that, or were you brought on to create it?
I would say brought on to create. So I spent a long time at Abbott. We had a global team of about 250 people. I'm 50% of the team at Impulse Dynamics. But I think it's very, the initial research in Impulse Dynamics started in 1999. I mentioned FDA approval came 20 years later. I don't think a lot of people put a ton of thought into reimbursement during that time period. I don't say that from a detrimental point of view, or meant to be critical. But a lot of the focus was on developing the therapy, meeting clinical endpoints, getting human trials going. I think the more you can work your reimbursement strategy in parallel with all those processes, the better off you're going to be. And again, talking about closing this gap, if you can work those things in parallel rather than sequentially, your commercial opportunities may be dramatically greater.
Heather, what's been your experience? I mean, was there something in place at HeartFlow? When did you join the company? Did you have to create a reimbursement? And did you have to sell, John Stevens and Campbell Rogers John is the CEO, Campbell is the Chief Medical Officer, on the importance of reimbursement, or were they cognizant of that?
Okay, so now again, you've asked many questions.
Sorry.
No. So I've been with HeartFlow for just over 9 years. I'm an engineer, and I actually worked on the technology itself for about the first half of that, program management, overseeing the software development. And then I somehow, with Campbell Rogers, was convinced to come over to the business side of the house and work on our reimbursement strategy. And I actually, the similarity there is we had a very complex distributed architecture for software development. And when you go into reimbursement, same thing. It's not, there's no silver bullet. There's no one way to do it. It's a complex strategy with a lot of moving pieces, and you have to use all of those to move everything forward. So I'm a newbie in this world, especially sitting between these two people that have decades of experience. So HeartFlow, what they did right is they were thinking about reimbursement from early on, and they developed the clinical evidence to support that. And specifically, you can have clinical trials to get FDA clearance. That might be entirely different from the clinical data you want to get reimbursement in place that's showing outcomes. So safety and efficacy with the FDA, but then you really have to show through your clinical trials that you're achieving outcomes to get the reimbursement in place. And so I was really given a gift as I stepped into this, that we had this really essential foundational trial that showed not just our improved clinical outcomes, but the cost effectiveness. And so we were able to use that to start approaching the payers. But then, just like Chris said, the strategy, it's coding, coverage, and payment. So you get coding in place, and then you have to be tackling coverage. We had the data to support that, and then really establishing payment. All of those are different mechanisms, different people you're talking to from different groups, and both within Medicare and the private insurers. So we had done a lot of the work to get the data in place, but we really didn't have a strategy, and that's when I started working with Adi here.
And we're going to get back to a couple of the issues that you raised in your comments. Adi, let me go to you and just say, have you seen this kind of evolution on the part of your clients in terms of a recognition of the importance of reimbursement and kind of seeing it moving up their priority list?
Oh, yes, I would say two things. One is I disagree with your premise that reimbursement wasn't always the top concern. Okay. I think it was just, overshadowed by products that didn't get through FDA clearance, but it was always a problem, and it continues to be a problem. But the other point is that there was a discussion yesterday by some of the investors about several companies. They mentioned Inari and Shockwave. And although I have some insights about those companies, what I am saying to you is publicly available information, is that those two companies have, in their own strategies, really, again, harmonized their regulatory and reimbursement strategies. Inari is a 510K company. They have products that they've brought to market that are 510K predicated on previous devices. Their products fit into existing payment infrastructure. They bill with existing codes and have existing reimbursement, and are doing, very well by understanding that their business fits into these predetermined reimbursement framework. Shockwave, on the other hand, has a very different strategy. They are a new product with a new solution, and they had breakthrough designation. They have intravascular lithotripsy, which had previously not been used in arterial vessel disease, both coronary and peripheral. And they are very clear about the fact that everything they're doing is new. They've gotten, I think I mentioned their breakthrough, they've gotten additional payment in the inpatient setting, in the outpatient setting, and they're pushing all those boundaries to recognize that the value of the technology they've developed has incremental value to the healthcare system and therefore merits additional reimbursement. And I think that, and both are successful companies, if you look at their valuations, but very different approaches and a very different level of investment in their reimbursement and market access development processes. So you can do whatever you want. You can be whatever kind of company you want to be, but you have to be sure that the plan that you have for your regulatory development is going to bear fruit once you try to get paid for it, and once the physicians that you're encouraging to use your new products understand how they're going to get paid for it, and trust that that's going to happen.
So let's talk about that issue of coordinating regulatory and reimbursement strategies, because oftentimes in the industry, regulatory and reimbursement, you would almost think it's one word. The people say regulatory and reimbursement without understanding, they're just two completely different worlds. And the biggest difference, or one of the biggest differences, is that for as challenging as it was and it still is to deal with FDA and CDRH, you're generally dealing with one agency. In the reimbursement side of the house, you've not only got CMS to deal with, and we can talk a little bit about the challenges of dealing with CMS, and it's not in any way to, really minimize the commitment. There's, I think, institutional issues at CMS that maybe puts them where CDRH was a decade ago, and hopefully things will change. But you also have the MACs and you have the private payers, so that maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was really focused on CMS, and Medicare and everybody else would kind of fall in line after that. But that's I'm interested in your take on it, but it seems that that's no longer the situation. So you've got to deal with all these other entities, and particularly the private payers are their own black holes, and trying to get information from them as far as what their standards are. Chris, what's your take on the kind of landscape of reimbursement?
Yeah, so I work more on the reimbursement side. I'm not a regulatory expert, but I'll say, we have breakthrough. Our experience with the FDA has been very streamlined, and you guys likely know that the MedTech industry funds lots of headcount at the FDA, so there's some level of reciprocity, for lack of a better word there. So, when we went through the sprint discussions, we've got a breakthrough product on the market, 2 additional ones in the pipeline. That cadence of activity is very regular, very predictable, and very streamlined. As Steve mentioned, you don't typically get that at CMS, partly because you're dealing with DOC on payment issues, you're dealing with CAG on coverage issues, you may be dealing with a different team for a HCPCS code, CPT is through AMA, so it's a very kind of fragmented world in the reimbursement space, whereas from a regulatory point of view, thinking of the US market at least, again, a very typically streamlined experience with the FDA, much more predictable, I would say. We talked about kind of AMA and CMS. There are, 1,500 commercial insurance companies. So it's, you go from kind of one well-defined entity to this Wild West landscape where you've got an almost innumerable number of stakeholders, all with different aims.
And Heather, HeartFlow has had success in getting reimbursement, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about the success you've had, particularly with some of the private payers who, for other companies, we're going to have somebody from iRhythm here, and just schedules didn't work out, but it's public information that they've had a problem with Noridian in terms of getting reimbursement. HeartFlow was able to get reimbursement from Noridian. So, I'm not necessarily asking you to talk about that specific situation, but talk about your strategy generally about how you go about dealing with this multiple of players that are in the reimbursement space.
Yeah, it is complex and fragmented is the perfect description. Just some of our history, we got assigned Category 3 codes in 2018, and our first big fight was with Medicare, and it comes back to the FDA language and labeling. So in our FDA description, we had the term post-processing because we were taking the CTA, we were doing some form of post-processing, and then using our algorithms to calculate the blood flow. And so CMS's initial, when Category 3 codes come out, they immediately start assigning them into buckets of, are they going to pay for them? Are they going to bundle them? Will they let the MACs decide? So they took our codes and we're going to bundle it with the CT itself. The difference, if that were to happen, CT today pays about $182 in the hospital setting. It would have completely ended, for lack of, we would have gotten really creative with some unique business models for our technology, but with CMS, we were able to convince them that we weren't just post-processing as part of the CT, that we are creating this whole new data set that was of value and had an impact on the clinical outcomes for these patients. Based on that, they assigned us into a new tech APC category, and that established payment, initially it was at $1,450 in hospital setting. But we didn't have coverage. So CMS, we went through all this work with them. We got this incredible win, $1,450 in the hospitals, but then the MACs get to decide, the Medicare contractors, there's 7 across the country, they get to decide whether they're going to cover the code or not. And their standing at the time was to not cover any Category 3 codes. So then we were immediately hustling to, we had already been talking with the MACs, but we had to knock each of those down to get coverage in place. And then beyond that, go to the commercial payers. And again, it's first coverage and then payment. Well, not necessarily sequential, but in general, we were working on getting coverage policies in place. There's, you hit all your major payers, then, we had the blues, like you just work on knocking those down. And we established coverage. It took us about 2 years to get up over 90% coverage across the commercial payers, and that's considered like
lightning speed.
That's like, you guys have the amazing product. By the way, I've known about HeartFlow for a long time. I know lots of people that work there and physicians that love it. Diagnostic procedure versus a therapeutic procedure. When you have I would tell people breakthrough is a great regulatory tool. When I think the last panelist talked about unmet need for a life-threatening condition, which feels like a place investors would want to go, right? Clinicians would want to go. But turn that over to the mindset of an insurance provider is unmet need is a new cost. So, you have to think of what is your product bringing from a clinical point of view but also what's the perception going to be from the payer point of view, right? If you're, replacing something with a cheaper alternative or come up with a diagnostic that they may eliminate an unnecessary procedure, the perception may be one thing, but if you're, bringing an amazing clinical therapy that's never been delivered before, again, you're an incremental cost. So, the stakeholder decisions are incredibly important when you look at, approaching for coverage, because what you guys deliver and what we deliver are very different and will be perceived very differently.
And then the whole issue of institutional inertia. And Chris, you went through a situation where Heather mentioned Category 3 codes. Mm-hmm. So the whole issue of Category 3 codes was presumably dealt with when the 21st Century Cares Act kind of eliminated, the option. Yep. But, and I'll let you fill in the details, it still took a while before, several of the MACs.
Yeah, I mean, so, the MAC said categorically, all 7, that we don't cover procedures described by Category 3 codes because we consider them not medically necessary, which again is the Medicare standard for coverage across the board. And if you ask the AMA what a Category 3 code, that's not what it is at all. But it took until July of 2020, I think the Cures Act was 2016, so there was a pretty long incubation period where these Category 3 codes were not covered by way of blanket policies. And it took a lot of effort from the MedTech industry and lots of folks to say, hey, look, this is not what the law says should happen. But again, that was a 4-year period where our codes were created in 2016. So we lived that same evolution of saying, look, just because we have a Category 3 code, that shouldn't make us automatically not reasonable and necessary for a Medicare beneficiary. But it was a struggle, a big struggle.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
So let me ask both of you, Heather and Chris, to talk about use of an outside consultant. When do you look to use outside consultants? There are different stages of, we've walked through kind of how broad a process it is in the 3 different buckets. And so are there different consultants with different sets of expertise that you would use either at different stages of the company or different stages of your reimbursement pathway? And then Dee, I just want to ask you about the kind of flip side of working with companies.
Sure. The way we've approached it with HeartFlow is really early on, it was purely consulting because we were just figuring out how we wanted to develop our strategy and get those pieces in place. And we had multiple consultants to work on that. As we got more into an execution stage, we brought more resources in-house, and it was just more tactical and working across all the different payers and carrying out the strategy. But even now, as we've gotten through a lot of the major barriers or milestones, we still use consultants regularly to revisit strategy. I mean, your strategy is constantly evolving. It's not like one thing you decide on day one and execute against and you come out the other side in 4 to 6 years. For us, it's just been continuously evolving each time we get new information or get a win and carrying that forward. So it's frequently just checking back with our advisors or consultants to help us tweak our strategy, or sometimes it's just getting us to the right people. They all have good networks, and you need to know who you're talking to and how to approach the different institutions.
But let me also ask you, for companies in the room that are kind of starting out and looking to either build a relationship, there's also the element of what kind of expertise do you need to retain in-house so that you can effectively work with, I don't want to say supervise, but collaborate with a consultant? I mean, both of you, are at your respective companies. Heather, I know you moved over from a different spot. But you know, again, if you're talking to your peers, you know, what kind of in-house expertise should a small company have at a minimum, even if you're working with an outside consultant?
Go ahead.
I mean, I would say for the stage where Impulse Dynamics is, or probably a lot of other companies in the room, you need a really good generalist. You know, I think I know a lot about, a little bit about a lot of things, but you know, it's the ability to kind of understand what are all the strategic areas where you've got to make progress, and then identifying a consultant that can help in each of those. And a lot of these decisions are, like, for companies at the beginning stages, are incredibly high stakes, right? So, you know, and you know, if you look at like the CPT coding cycle, you know, if you don't have a successful application, you don't just go back next month, right? So, you know, you could set yourself back potentially years. I think, you know, looking at companies kind of at this stage where most of the folks in this room probably are, I think it's really important to have a good generalist that knows kind of all the initiatives that have to take place. But then you're probably going to be deploying consultants for very kind of specific, highly detailed work in each of those specific areas.
Steve, can I make a comment?
Yeah, let me flip it around and just, from the perspective of when companies come to you, what do you look for? What do you need in terms of commitment? In other words, do you need a commitment from a senior executive who says, okay, we're going to really be committed to driving forward on this reimbursement pathway? What do you look for?
It depends on the stage where the company is when I speak with them, but the way I sort of position my practice is that I'm like a contractor. I can build you a beautiful house. You tell me what you want it to look like. I can tell you how to get from sticks and bricks to a beautiful home. But if you want very esoteric, you know, Spanish tile for your bathroom, I can't do that, but I know a guy. So I can source that consultant in and help you so that you don't have to search and go through 50 other consultants to find the right person who has the relationships. Because ultimately it's about what relationships do I have that can accelerate your ability to interface with the right decision makers. Chris, you mentioned that at FDA you deal with one or two people, certainly one department. At CMS, you may have to meet with 20 different people in 5 different departments, and there's no schedule or, you know, call us back in 2 months. Everything is initiated by you, the company, and the purpose of your meeting and why you want to meet. You've got to get their attention and their interest to care about your issue when they're dealing with, you know, heart failure on one phone call and dermatological issues on another, oncological issues on the next call, and then you've got 30 minutes and you've got to get your message across to physicians, in some cases, who are generalists, internal medicine, some pediatricians at Medicare, a variety of different kinds of individuals who don't have the depth of knowledge that you have, and you've got to convey your specific policy need and the clinical need at the same time. So a lot of what good consultants will do is help you figure out who do you need to talk to, who do you want to avoid talking to until you've talked to someone else, and that's all within Medicare. And then you have, you know, that's a cakewalk compared to commercial payers who won't take meetings, won't take phone calls, send me what you have, I'll get back to you, and they never get back to you. And so how do you pierce that veil and get in front of these people and get their attention when they're distracted by all these other things? So part of being a good consultant is figuring out what do you need now, and really I try to scale my projects to figure out what does the client need today and what do they need to take them to the next step. I do a lot of due diligence for the investors who want to understand, does the company have a reimbursement strategy? Have they thought about it? And if they have, can you road test it? Tell me if you think it's viable or if they're, you know, relying on assumptions that are going to be invalidated in the next, you know, fee schedule. Help me know that what they're talking about will get us to that next step. So it's really thinking about what do you need long term, but how do we define that in the near term? How do we get you a strategy that's going to move you from one place to the next? And I also always tell my clients, here's what it's going to cost you. So whether you want to staff that and pay an FTE for that, whether you want to have 6 different consultants do the different pieces for you, it's a bandwidth issue, and it's finding good talent as well. I think it's wonderful to have in-house reimbursement expertise because they're constantly being tapped as the internal consultant to help answer questions, but it's essential to accelerate your business to get to where you want to go, to shorten that time to the access for the people that you need to see, the decision makers and the stakeholders that are going to influence those decisions.
Is there a best time for a company? Could a company come too soon and you say, you know, come back? And, you know, again,
I've never had a company come too soon. Ever. Never had a company come too soon.
Okay. But in terms of coordinating reimbursement and regulatory strategy. You know,
Right.
I would imagine that the company's got to have, you know, those
Right.
ducks in a row in order to come to you and make it a fruitful discussion.
Right, and there are times, you know, the work is in pulses, it's in boluses. You know, I may come in and do a strategy, work with a company for 3 to 6 months, and then they need to execute on the clinical trial. They don't need me. They don't need to be, maybe just to monitor what's going on in the background so they're not surprised by something they didn't anticipate, but there's no active work. So that's the time to use a consultant for a short period of time. The earlier the better. Once the company has a sense of what is the FDA asking them for from a clinical perspective that's going to get them to the clearance, then the very next question needs to be, okay, what do the payers want to hear in order to get paid? And if that information is different, if the answer to that question is different than the FDA, then you need to build in that data collection into that same study you're doing for FDA so that you can use it later. So it's never too early.
Yeah, I just want to add one other point because you referenced it earlier, that whether you know your chief strategist is in-house or a consultant, they absolutely need to have executive buy-in because there's so many layers to this, and it can, you know, you can have an impact on your regulatory, or your regulatory can have an impact on your reimbursement, but your business models and how you're selling commercially can impact your reimbursement. So like I've had to push back on our sales leadership of not lowering our price because Medicare lowered their price, because then you get into this downward spiral. So we've had to hold our price steady and fight that fight. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have, you know, the backing of our CEO. So, you know, tying into that executive level, I think, is crucial to make sure that your strategy is supported across the company with all the different initiatives going on.
We've only got a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions, come to the microphone or shout them out. Or
I have one. How do you make a determination whether to use a consultant versus bringing someone in-house? I mean, what are the factors you consider in making that kind of, and is that a binary choice?
Yeah, I mean, I look at expertise and essentially, you know, cost versus, you know, having the cost of the consulting versus having them in-house, how much we're going to use them. Like, are they episodic engagements, which a lot are, but then it's an episode to figure out what your strategy or next move is, but then you have to implement it. And for the most part, we execute internally, but we use a lot of consulting for strategy.
Once you develop the strategy, is there a continuing role for an in-house person? Or at that point, have you hired somebody that is less useful than they were during an earlier period of hire?
I think somebody needs to own the strategy and know how all the pieces connect. Like, nothing's in isolation. And so if you don't have an in-house leader over that strategy, then you need a long-term consultant that's going to see you through, you know, all the different barriers.
I think
This isn't like one and done.
it can't be one and done, and I would say that it's, you know, reimbursement is typically a pretty dynamic landscape, and things unfold over a matter of years. You know, there's multiple Medicare rules that affect our industry that come out every year. So to me, I mean, I don't think for Heather and I will ever work ourselves out of a job. At least I like to think we won't. But I think, you know, that strategy is not going to be something that you can just bake and say, okay, we're going to execute on this, and it's going to unfold over a couple of months or a couple of quarters. You know, changing your position on coding or changing your position in payment or coverage, those are years-long initiatives for most companies. I mean, I think it's very difficult to think of sort of defining the strategy in one of our roles and then making a quick exit and not being there to help the execution.
I want to touch a little bit on international, because obviously companies, you know, are looking to market their products overseas. And Heather, you had a couple of diverse examples. I mean, you achieved reimbursement in Japan. HeartFlow achieved reimbursement in Japan, and also in the UK. I would imagine it's two different processes and two different systems. And, you know, I know some of them might have predated you.
No, yeah. So we we had to navigate through both of those systems.
And how did you do it? Internally? Did you bring on other consultants? I mean, Adi, did you work on those?
I did not, no.
No, not internationally, but we do have other consultants that we use internationally because each company that you go to has a different framework for how you achieve reimbursement. And, even the countries that have, like the UK, a national level system, the NHS, in innovation, a lot of the times the reimbursement framework isn't there, and so they're using innovation funds to help, basically bring new technology in and figure out how to reimburse it. So, a lot of it is really just figuring out how to work through these programs, just to get started, you have essentially temporary funding through innovation funds, and then try and parlay that into a long-term strategy, which is what we did in the UK. We got started with an innovation technology program. That was a 3-year program funded by the NHS, and then last April, the NHS is now mandating our technology because they were able to collect the data and show the benefit to their healthcare system.
And you have a study going on in the Netherlands, right?
Yeah, we just kicked off a study in the Netherlands. This is like a 4-year study. So in the meantime, that helps us get funding, for specific sites within the country. And then, it's just you're building data within each geography. We're also doing the Forfait Innovation in France. We're in the process of submitting to that. There's some countries that just will not move forward if you don't have data in their specific geography. Other countries, Italy, Spain, we can shift in there and use the existing.
But again, the point is that reimbursement and regulatory are quite different. I mean, this is not like going to Europe and getting CE mark.
We've had our CE mark since 12.
Each country, you generally have to, satisfy their requirements, and that may mean additional study in that country.
What I'd say, I would like to see.
Go for it.
I would like to see a senior executive that's tasked with reimbursement and market strategy at the executive committee of every company, and it's a bona fide role in order to be the one. It is one of the few customer-facing positions. You've got to have a great marketing strategy of the physicians, but you've got to have someone who is tapped into the payer community and how they're changing policy that related to your therapy, or your device or your treatment, whatever it might be, specifically for your therapy, but also in the therapeutic area. There may be some changes that will come to your doorstep a year or 2 years hence that you need to understand, and that person's got to be there communicating that at the executive level so that the company is sourcing itself properly, staffing properly, and has the resources to address these problems before they get out of control.
So, we titled the panel talking about the regulatory reimbursement gap, and this notion of parallel review, broadly speaking, in terms of having CMS and FDA trying to work together, has obviously been discussed for years, and yet there are baby steps that are going on. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the NTAP program. And Chris, for Impulse Dynamics, that was something that worked out well. So if you could just talk through, for those people who aren't familiar with the new technology add-on payment program, which is not a new program. It's been around for, I think, 20 years or so, and it didn't work well, charitably speaking, for a while, and it's been tweaked, and it sounds like, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but from Impulse Dynamics experience, that it actually has worked out well for you guys.
So, NTAP is new technology add-on payment, which is an incremental payment tool on the inpatient side. The analog, which is actually probably more impactful for us, is the transitional pass-through program. But I want to go back to something Steve mentioned. I think parallel review sort of exists. It's like the unicorn. If anybody has successfully navigated parallel review, I'd like to know who you are, and I'll buy you a beer or 10, because parallel review sounded really good on paper, but we could never make it work. That's my unvarnished editorial comment. But I would say, NTAP filings and pass-through filings, you talk about high stakes, payment issues, perfect examples of where, I could do those applications, but I use a consultant. It happens to be a guy, is a former colleague, but I feel very confident with his work. And again, when you're talking about the material impact of an NTAP or a pass-through on your product, you get a second bite at the apple, but if you can get it right on the first try,
Talk a little
huge
bit
deal.
more. I mean, you don't have to get into the weeds,
Yep.
but the combination of having breakthrough bring with it a reimbursement component.
Yeah, I mean, so breakthrough, for those of you who don't know, automatically fulfills what's called the substantial clinical improvement criterion of either the pass-through application or the NTAP application. So what's probably historically been the biggest hurdle for those two applications, if you have FDA breakthrough designation, you automatically meet that criterion. For us personally, we went through the pass-through application using the old criteria and probably spent 4 to 5 times the amount of time on that application as we did on the NTAP application, and all of that delta was the substantial clinical improvement criterion. We were able to use our breakthrough designation to get NTAP, and it basically went from a massive undertaking to a nice checkbox. So breakthrough is not a panacea, but if you have an opportunity to get it, it's really a regulatory tool, but it does bleed over into the reimbursement space, specifically payment for sure. But one thing I will say very strongly is having breakthrough designation doesn't come with any coverage guarantees. So make sure people fully understand that.
But NTAP buys you what, 3 to 4 years?
NTAP and pass-through are both 2 to 3 years of incremental payments from CMS, and typically most Medicare Advantage payers as well, depending on how contracts are structured. But again, for a new technology, both of those devices can be incredibly, no pun intended, incredibly important in establishing commercial payment levels.
Great. So let me close with, I'm going to ask you to kind of look into your crystal balls, and I'm going to go back to the question that I kind of kicked things off with, which was, again, using this kind of regulatory reimbursement comparator. If we were talking 10 years where FDA was versus where FDA is now, if you look at reimbursement and say, okay, CMS may be kind of back where CDRH was a decade ago, what do you think has to happen? Because again, I go back to the fact that reimbursement involves far more than just CMS, and you've got, as we've talked about, the private payers who are loath to share data. So as you look to the future of reimbursement in MedTech, what do you think has to happen to kind of open things up a little bit and maybe make some of the progress that we've seen on the FDA?
When does this panel end?
Yeah, right. Anybody, I just throw that out.
For us, it's very specific related to artificial intelligence. So this is a major issue with CMS right now. They don't have pricing policies, and they don't know how to value an AI-based technology. So this is where we've just been digging in and trying to work with them to figure it out. But eventually, they will have a formal policy for this, and it's impacting the coding world as well. So, it's a very specific example, but I think in 10 years, they will have, a policy around that, and we won't be able to be so creative.
Yeah. I mean, you need a benefit category to get paid by Medicare, and a lot of the digital health products don't fit into a benefit category. So, I mean, first things first, that's a major hurdle. I mean, all the things that we saw this morning, which seemed really, really cool, Adina and I were sitting in the back thinking, for us, we've kind of heard those pitches and this discussion for a long time, but if there's no benefit category at Medicare for digital health products, it's all fun and games, but the rubber can't really hit the road. So I think that's an area, I totally agree with Heather, where we've got to see some changes. The other thing, and this is a personal big impact for Impulse, is I hate to push more regulation, but the prior authorization burden with commercial insurance companies has become an immense barrier to care, to the point where at least I think it's risen to the level that it needs attention from Congress, particularly for Medicare Advantage plans. I mean, I think if I were to look at one area where I'd like to see some legislative solutions, and I'm always hesitant to say we should have more legislation, we need help as an industry around streamlining the prior authorization process, because it's become a major, major barrier to access for lots of patients.
Adina, we'll give you the last word. And let me just throw in one other factor is, I mean, CMS, for example, just started this new Navigator program. Do you see reason for optimism as far as, and again, I'm not going to get into the private side now, but do you see optimism in terms of the way things are evolving at CMS?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, so that's a problem. But as I said, CMS is a cakewalk compared to the commercial payers. So I will say that the newer people that are joining CMS and are bringing a fresh perspective are really listening, I think, much more so, and are more engaged and willing to understand from the MedTech perspective. I think that it's hard for them because they haven't walked in our shoes. So we have to teach them what we're experiencing. And I think that they genuinely try to then figure out how they can work within the constraints of the statutes they work in to deliver what we're trying to do. So I am hopeful, because if I weren't, then I would stop doing this. It's too frustrating as it is. But I want to mention that, a lot of great people are working on developing and advancing the CMS transparency and solving some of these problems. The commercial payer side is immensely more difficult and needs so much more attention. The transparency problem is almost insurmountable. I work with a group called the National Association of Managed Care Physicians, who are medical directors at health plans who are trying to understand some of these problems and trying to say, okay, well, what can we do institutionally at our for-profit, cost-reducing organizations where we take premium dollars, but we want to hold on to as much of those dollars as we can, and you're asking me to cover more technology at a higher cost. Why should I even let you in the door? And our story is, we can save you money if you just get past your own limitations of the boxes, but it's not a public forum.
Right.
And so as many as the challenges at CMS that exist, which I am encouraged about, I think we have an obligation as an industry to also try to push the commercial insurance industry.
Right, and concepts like transparency and accountability, which are, again, we had to work through it a long time to even get to where we are with FDA.
Right.
CMS at least acknowledges those.
Right, they do.
Whereas the private side, they don't. So absolutely. Well, that's great. Well, listen, let's thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion on what will continue to be a very, very complex issue. So we hope you enjoyed that discussion about reimbursement from our San Francisco Innovation Summit. And I would encourage you to keep an eye out for our next podcast, which will also focus on reimbursement, and it will feature an interview with Josh Mackauer. Josh is a name familiar to many in the MedTech industry. He wears a lot of hats. He's currently was recently named to head the Stanford Biodesign program, a program that he actually co-founded, but he is still working at the venture firm NEA on their MedTech team, and also has his own incubator, Exploramed, which has given rise to a number of companies, most prominently Acclarent and Neotrack. So keep an eye out for our next podcast, an interview with Josh Mackauer. And again, you can hear all of the Market Pathways podcasts on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And we encourage you to go to our website, medtechstrategist.com, to get more information on both our publications, MedTech Strategist and Market Pathways, as well as our conferences. And again, thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.